My name is Ann Bookman, and I'm director of the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy. I have the great honor of running this center at UMass Boston in the McCormack Graduate School, and I want to welcome you all very warmly. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the third in a lecture series that we're presenting that is part of a fellowship program that we started just recently for distinguished public service leaders. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that center in a minute. The program in a minute, but I just want to first recognize a few special guests. I'm very pleased to welcome and recognize members of the Center's Advisory Board who are here. If you could just raise your hand, Tess Brown. Where did she go, Tess? I know she's here. Okay. Karen Courtney. Well, I'll just read through the list. Carol Donovan, Joyce Faribault Bowling, Helen Chin Schlichty, Martha Bernard Welsh, and Alice Wolfe. And I also want to say that Carol Donovan and Alice Wolfe were in the state legislature, both served as state representatives, and in the spirit of this fellowship program, I just want to thank them particularly for their public service. So now I'd like to tell you briefly about our new fellowship program for distinguished public service leaders and why we established it. We launched the program for two key reasons. First, we wanted to honor and preserve the legacy of experienced women leaders in Massachusetts who have had distinguished careers in either the public sector or the nonprofit sector. Second, we wanted to address the underrepresentation of women in politics and public life by building a diverse intergenerational pipeline that connects women leaders with experienced women leaders with a new generation of women leaders. Through a rigorous nomination and selection process, we chose 4 amazing women for our inaugural cohort for this program. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce them to you. Unfortunately, 2 are not here in person, 1 not yet. So Dolores Mitchell, you will be hearing from very soon. Maria Elena Latona, right here next to Dolores. The Honorable Patricia McGovern, who many of you know, is also one of the inaugural cohort. Unfortunately, she's down with a very bad bug, and we all told her stay home. She wanted to come here, Dolores, anyway. And Jackie Jenkins Scott, who I'm sure a number of you know as well, is on her way from the airport to here, stuck in traffic, but she will be with us shortly. And we're very, very pleased to have all 4 of these amazing women. These women have each been appointed as fellows for 2 years to be in residence at the center, and during that time, they are and will continue to do 3 main things. First, reflect on their own careers and public service and share those reflections through this public lecture series and in other ways, both formal and informal. Second, they become mentors to the graduate students in our 1-year certificate program in gender, leadership, and public policy. And I know there's a number of women from this year's cohort who are here. Could you just raise your hand if you're here from the cohort? They're all kind of in back. Anyway, we have an amazing group of women in this year's cohort, and very, very proud of them. And the third is to contribute to women's history. In partnership with Healy Library and Archive and the faculty in UMass Boston's History Department, each fellow will contribute to the development of something we're calling the Women's Public Leadership Archive. Now, if you're as old as me, you may think that this is a bunch of paper in folders. No, this is an electronic website, okay? They are donating, each fellow is donating all or a portion of their papers to the library's archive. And during this academic year, we are going to be having graduate students trained in oral history interview them. So these interviews will be deposited, so to speak, in this electronic archive along with photographs and other memorabilia that they would like to consider. And we hope that the Women's Public Leadership Archive will become this really exciting, interactive website that women of all ages will go to learn about women's public leadership. I want to stress the center's commitment to this program as a way of contributing to the construction of, as I said, a diverse intergenerational pipeline for women's leadership. I also want to mark today, just about a year after the first woman to run for president as the nominee of a major party lost the election but won the popular vote. I think that loss is still hard to swallow as we fight for women's rights and all efforts to repeal what in many of this room have won through years of hard work and struggle. But this is a special moment. I think we are pivoting. On Tuesday night, we began to see a glimmer of hope, I think, a ray of sunshine. For the first time, we have 6 women elected to the Boston City Council, women of color. Woo! And we elected 3 women as mayors in the Commonwealth, including an African-American woman. And many women had runs across the country. I was reading on one website that 15 of the seats in the Virginia legislature flipped, and 11 of them were women endorsed by Emily's List, which some of you know. So we're very proud of all the wins that are going on. So I think I also want to add that 4 of our alumni of our certificate program ran for election. 2 won, 2 lost, but we're very proud of all of them. 2 ran for city council seats, 1 out in Ohio, and 2 ran for school committee seats. And I just think that indicates the kind of momentum that we're beginning to see building. So let us not despair when we hear the next charge of sexual harassment hit the news. Let us pledge to fight for women's physical and emotional safety and dignity. And in addition, let's run for office or work on a campaign of a woman running for office, and let's fight for gender parity in government with our hearts and our minds. So without further delay, let me introduce Jane Malmy, who's going to introduce our speaker. Jane is a member of our advisory board and has a distinguished career in her own right. She is an attorney who has worked in government and the nonprofit sector. Her early career was with the Mass Department of Revenue, and she recently retired from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, where she was a fellow. I also just want to add a few special words of appreciation to Jane, because this is actually her last year on our board. I had to sadly accept her resignation. I just want to say that Jane not only always had something insightful and wonderful to say in our board discussions, got involved in many board projects, but actually chaired 2 of our most important board committees that are named after our founder, Betty Tamor. And these provide important scholarships to our graduate students in the certificate program. So Jane, I just want to say thank you so much for your many years of service. We're going to miss you greatly. Your wisdom, your dedication are truly wonderful. Thank you. So I'm pleased to present Jane Malmy.
Thank you. Aren't we lucky to have such a wonderful director of the program and to have this program? Well, this is a true honor for me to be able to introduce Dolores Mitchell. Now, we go back a long way, and maybe this is not the time to say how far we go back. I remember many years of us knowing each other, but Dolores is a person who has accomplished so much in so many ways, both as a leader in bringing women into responsible positions in government and advocating for them. I certainly remember when I had decided to go back myself to law school, and then in order to be qualified to go into public service. She was then helping in the administration of the first administration of Governor Dukakis, and I think she helped me get my first job. So, so I'm was very grateful to that. In the Department of Revenue, there was a court case, of course, that required the Department of Revenue to oversee the development of a proper system of property tax administration in the Commonwealth. And Governor Dukakis couldn't find anybody who was willing to take that on, and the Department of Revenue did not want to do it at all. And so Dolores was helpful in persuading me that that would be a very nice job for me. So you see, and I was grateful for it. At any rate, she has served with such distinction. When you think being the executive director of the Group Insurance Commission, that's the job that the whole United States, when you think about health insurance and all that nobody knows how to handle. We need her right now, don't we? We need her right now. And every governor, Republican or Democratic, was so grateful that she was here so many years, from 1987 on. We have, and I know, and some of you know, I'm now a retiree. So I know what a good job she has done for us and for the Commonwealth. So we are very grateful for the work she has done, and her experience and her leadership are something that hopefully will benefit all of us through the fellowship, and we're so anxious to hear what she can tell us. So welcome and thank you, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Jane. I'm glad that I understand that they're videoing this presentation. Two of my children, Elizabeth and Clifford, are here, and my son-in-law, Ned. And I was thinking that if you get a copy, you could play it at my funeral and not have to have a eulogy. That way you don't have to fight with your other brother about who gets to say what. Yeah, right, in any case. And I also want to thank my colleague, Maria Elena, and if Jackie, I don't see Jackie, so I guess she hasn't come in yet. Yeah. In any case, and Anne, who I suspect had something to do with my being here, and the staff at the center who've been extremely solicitous and helpful and nurturing and all those good things that make a speaker's life more pleasant or less terrifying, as the case may be. And I want to get started, though, right away. Oh, well, no, one other thing. There are so many in this audience that are old friends, former colleagues, and so on. I can't even begin to point out any one individual because I know I'd be forgetting somebody that I would then feel guilty about having forgotten. So, but all of you, thank you so much for being here. So, what do we do now? And how are we going to get ourselves out of the slough of despond? I last addressed this audience on the kickoff reception of the program, appointing the first four senior fellows, distinguished, I like that adjective a lot, about a year ago. It was election time then, as I recall, and most of us were not yet fully aware of the tsunami that was about to hit the country. What a difference a year makes. Because of the turmoil that particular earth-shaking election has made, preparing these remarks has been more challenging than usual. I'm a practiced procrastinator, and my standard modus operandi is to let ideas kind of cook around in the back of my head until panic hits when I realize that the deadline is the day after tomorrow. Then I sit down and write what I want to say. But this year, those somewhat inchoate thoughts have been kind of stimulated stimulated or maybe overstimulated by one jaw-dropping event, appointment, tweet, hiring, firing, press conference, revelation, shocker, and most recently indictment after another. Grabbing hold of a major theme under those circumstances is sort of like trying to hold a handful of balloons of helium balloons in the middle of a hurricane. And to illustrate how tough this has been, considering the challenge of responding to this week's good news. I read the paper this morning and I said, oh hell, I got to write the damn speech all over again. But remember, it ain't over till it's over, and do not underestimate what's going to happen over the next year and a half to 2 years. More about that in a couple of minutes. So, obviously, I had to talk about politics and about what's happening in the country. And of course, the raison d'etre of the program, of the center's program, is precisely on that same subject about politics and policy. So I want to focus on how we can take our America back. Admittedly, an imperfect country, nevertheless an America of hope, of promise, and of opportunity. In short, to make America really great again, despite the chaos of today. Now, a short detour here. Ann Bookman convinced me that I had to spend a little time talking about my personal history. This is largely for the sake of the students who are here. And that I should therefore digress to take my favorite subject up, namely myself. So I modestly agreed. So you're going to get 2 speeches for the price of 1. And I'm going to try to tie these 2 topics together at the end and still save room for our panel to chime in. So, to begin at the beginning, I cannot remember a time when I was not interested in and aware of politics and government. My parents weren't particularly activist, but they never missed an election, and President Roosevelt was their hero. And his enemies were their enemies, and the politics of his elections were the news of the day at our dinner table. So, putting my interest into action, I ran for president of the 5th grade. But then I did something really stupid. I voted for my opponent, apparently believing that he was going to do the gentlemanly thing and vote for me. Wrong. I lost by 1 vote. And I never made that mistake again. Now, nevertheless, my political appetite was whetted, and I got involved in high school and college working for candidates or causes until I forgot my 5th grade trauma and ran for class president against the captain of the football team. This was at Ohio State, where I don't need to say anything more, do I? A fact that I kind of overlooked because I never went to any of the games. The young man was, in my no doubt biased opinion, a dolt. And I, except for physical education, was a straight A student. In fact, I attributed my academic success to the fact that I had the library at Ohio State to myself every Saturday. So, of course, I lost again, as I should have predicted. But I should have known that running against overwhelming odds was something I somehow or other wasn't ready to accept. And years later, I did it all over again when I ran to be the national chairman of Americans for Democratic Action against a well-known congressman, Allard Lowenstein by name, who had spearheaded the country's anti-Vietnam War campaign. I did it because that very liberal organization had never had a contested election for president, nor a woman president, and I thought it was time they did both. So I lost that one too. And after that, I ran for school committee in my town against an incumbent townie with an enormous extended family. I ran a brilliant campaign and had all the school reform people and all the non-townies supporting me. This time, I lost by 26 votes. I have a little list of people who didn't vote. Not a bad showing, you might say, but I think you might not think unreasonable to suggest that I seem to be a slow learner or else a masochist. Why did I keep tilting at windmills? Self-esteem is not my problem, as those of you who know me can know. And I am also, I think, pretty resilient. But the truth is that it was ego that kept me in the game. Candidates rarely admit to this, but being a candidate is a hoot. It's a real ego trip. People spend hours working for you for nothing. You get picked up and driven home, and someone else parks the car and hangs up your coat, and your name and your picture plastered all over town and in the local newspapers. Now, the lesson I would take from all of this is do not let fear of failure hold you back, or even the likelihood of failure. Even if you lose, if you fought hard, worked hard, and put on a credible campaign, you will gain more than you lose in new friends, new contacts, visibility, and experience. So I kept up my political activism through college and school and marriage and kids and beyond, often as a volunteer in organizations and campaigns and causes like welfare reform and political party reform and civil service reform and civil rights reform and low-income housing and where some of my partners in crime are sitting back in the middle of the room, and school desegregation and rent control and so on. And I worked on campaigns for governor and county commissioner and selectman and congressman. I did, however, break my record of failed campaigns by 2 victories at the local level, both initiated by a reformer named Michael Dukakis, who inspired me to run a reform slate for the very auspicious and important role of Democratic Town Committee in Watertown, and an individual race for Democratic State Committee woman, of which I won. Both of which I won. Of equal importance, I worked as an unpaid lobbyist and got to know the legislative process. And I was very involved in both the state and the local and the national level with the Women's Political Caucus. All of these activities had long-term effects on what happened next. So, being knowledgeable about a range of issues, especially women's issues, and knowing the legislative process and how it worked, and knowing how to count votes. I couldn't count them when I was the candidate, but I could count them for other people, both in the legislature and at the precinct level, meant that when Mike Dukakis ran for governor, I quit my paying job and took an unpaid one in his campaign, organizing constituency groups, and to everyone's surprise, he won. And I became his cabinet coordinator for the next 4 years. In that role, I continued to have my finger in many pies, and I added to my list of things I knew a little bit about, at least what were the major issues and who were the major players. Then, after 4 years in the governor's office, Michael had the bad taste to lose his reelection, and I spent the next 7 years working in the private sector, which was also an interesting experience. Then one day, I got a call from Michael's patronage secretary, who was, of course, not called that. He was the personnel director. But we all knew what he was really there for, asking if I wanted to be the executive director of something called the Group Insurance Commission. So I became the head of a large health insurance purchasing organization. Let me be very clear. I didn't know diddly squat about insurance. I got appointed. I did not get appointed, as people sometimes are, because I was an expert. What I was, in addition to being a longtime associate of the governor, was someone with a known track record in both issues and politics, and who had run an organization in the private sector, and I suspect the governor knew that I could be capable of learning the complexities of insurance and could be counted on not to make a big mess of things. So, now insurance can and frequently is boring. But health insurance, on the other hand, is challenging. And believe me, it was and is political. Deciding who gets what, who pays for it, who delivers it, and what are the rules that govern it. That's all political. So I spent the next quarter of a century making life miserable for health plans and doctors and hospitals, and my favorite target, the pharmaceutical industry, while also protecting the interests of patients, state employees, and retirees and their families, and Catherine, you will be glad to know that I was also keeping a lid on costs to both patients and the taxpayers. So, before I go back to discussing today's almost unbelievable political scene, given my experience, what do I believe that those of you who are here who are students need to be an effective leader? And how can you use those skills to help make the changes that we need, or for you to succeed in whatever it is you do? Here are a few of my favorite things. Be a risk taker, but try not to be suicidal. 2, don't be afraid to go outside of your comfort zone. If a job or a career path isn't exactly what you want, don't reject it out of hand. You never know what might happen or how interesting it might turn out to be, like insurance, for example. Do sweat the small stuff, not just the big stuff, and get credit for being reliable. It may give you some protection when you go out on a limb and want to do something really controversial. Be sure to learn the procedural stuff, not just the big philosophical ideas. Be good to your staff. This is critical. Help your employees to advance, even if this means that you might lose them. Share the credit. Give them visibility. Develop your bullshit detector. There are a lot of foolish ideas and people out there. Politics is simply loaded with them. And I'm not even talking about the deliberate peddlers of fake news. Sharpen your communication skills, both oral and written, to staff, to leadership, to the media, to live audiences. Public speaking is essential. Learn how to do it and do it well. If you show you're afraid, you make your audience nervous. So let them sense that you're having a good time. Make them laugh if you can. It's contagious. Show up. Be there when you don't have to be. Be around when and where decisions are being made, when crises strike and your staff needs support, when something awful happens. Your staff will take their behavioral cues from you. And most of all, keep your sense of humor and have fun. Politics can be a tough game, but despite the slings and arrows, there's nothing like taking people and organizations to a place they might not even know about, but where they need to be. Now, enough about me. Let's get back to 2017 and beyond. I would give you a 7th inning stretch at this time, but I do want to save time. And as you can tell by the speed at which I am talking, I'm very mindful of wanting to save time for the panel. So, where do we find ourselves? How are we doing as a society, and how are we doing under the leadership, and I use the word advisedly or loosely, of Donald Trump? And for this talk, what could I possibly say that has not been said already by others? There's just so much to be despondent about. The stock market may be booming, but the income of many Americans has fallen over the last dozen years, and upward mobility has precipitously declined. Parents no longer can assume that their children will live better lives than they did. The outcome of the so-called tax reform bill is, of course, still in doubt. Today we had another calendar shift, but one thing is certain. I would be happy to take a bet on this. If they get a bill passed, the rich will do better than anybody else. The gap between the haves and the have-nots is growing. But this is the next part is very important. So is distrust, dislike, and disdain for government and almost all other institutions. Newspapers, churches, schools, banks. Jeffrey Sachs, university professor at Columbia, who the Globe not being able to find anybody in the local academic scene, has been featuring in recent months. And he points to the disturbing phenomenon that he calls the collapse of civic virtue, the network of honesty and trust that undergirds our society. He attributes this decline to increasing secrecy, inequality, the impugning of the rich and the powerful to the rule of law. They're too big to either go to jail or to fail. The decline of political parties as vehicles for political participation. Citizens United or Corporations Are People, Supreme Court decision was, of course, a clear and present danger to the concept of a trusting community. It is perhaps the single most pernicious attack on our democratic system since the Dred Scott decision, a major contributor to the decline of citizen participation in our electoral process. Another major contributor is the revolving door between ex-officials of both parties, I'm sorry to say, and their lobbying for the very industries they used to regulate. And finally, and this will be not finally, I'm not through by a long shot, I challenge to you the decline of integrated grassroots political involvement, attributable in no small measure to the growing dominance of big money. Citizen participation has to be renewed and revived if we are to make America great again for all of us. And I choose the word integrated because that renewal, if it is to succeed, must be a very broad coalition, and coalitions are hard to build. It seems worthwhile to consider how this massive distrust of government became a major part of why we are here. In addition, not here, but here in the country. In addition to the issues I just described, we have the incredible proliferation and segregation of the media, technology run amok. All of us who railed against the dominance of the Chicago Tribune or the Manchester Union Leader or even the good gray Boston Globe had no idea what the proliferation of media outlets would mean. It is entirely possible to be a real news hound and never hear or read any news or views other than those you came to the paper or to the radio to hear. Cass Sunstein calls this information cocoons. For a healthy democracy, depth may be good, but breadth is both better and healthier, and for coalition building, it is essential. I would be remiss if, in talking about the growing gap between the super rich and the rest of us, I did not pay attention to one segment of the population whose plight both political parties conveniently ignored during the election of 2016 in their concern about the declining status of the middle class. That's the poor. Remember them? It's as though they had fallen off the face of the earth. But the poor are still with us, despite the efforts and programs that were designed to end or at least mitigate their situation. The percentage of workers with a BA or higher is at an all-time high, 35%. And women are now in the workforce at about 60%, while the poverty level over the last 40 years has basically stayed flat, and so have wage levels, especially at the lowest levels. Compared to other advanced countries, we have many more poor people than they do. A compelling statistic tells the story. 1 out of every 5 American children lives in poverty. In Denmark and Finland, it's 1 out of 20. So why does this biblical prediction that the poor you shall always have with you apply to the richest country in the world at a higher rate than it does in Scandinavia? The difference lies with public policy decisions we have made in this country over the last 30 years while we were rejecting the more aggressive approach taken in other countries of supporting significant transfer programs geared to reducing that gap. Pensions, welfare, financial support for housing, child care, and higher education. We can't blame the Trump people for the sins of the past 30 years, obviously, but they certainly own and brag about repealing or gutting any achievements of the Obama administration. And the new president also appears determined to eliminate much of the achievements of the past 100 years, making America a land of opportunity as well as making sure that in the expansion of economic growth, we didn't despoil the heritage of a country of incredible beauty and bounty. Remember, Democratic President Franklin Roosevelt brought us Social Security and programs to protect families and the elderly from poor. But go back even further and remember his Republican cousin, Teddy, the country's first environmental president, who created the national park system, established reclamation programs, bird sanctuaries, national forests, and national monuments. Repealing your immediate predecessor's regulations is one thing. Repealing the progress of 100 years is quite another. So what made all this possible? Well, I've given a couple of thoughts on that, but then there's that ticking clock called healthcare costs. This is not a side issue as one might think. As that well-known businessman Warren Buffett has said in stomach-churning language, healthcare costs are the tapeworm of American consumerism and competitiveness, We have let ourselves be co-opted, lock, stock, and barrel by the medical industrial complex. And shame on us for the craven surrender to the drug industry, a.k.a. pharma, to superorganized medical societies, dental associations, hospital associations, for creating and perpetuating an industry. And yes, it is an industry as well as a profession. I acknowledge that many in that industry know that they need to change, but many do not. Since they have us in their emotional clutches, they see no compelling need to hurry up to reform their practices or their pricing, and they have become enormously harmful as an influence on our economic well-being. Were our health care excessive costs and pricing policies to be brought under control, much of what we need to do to make America great again would become affordable. The supreme irony is that medical organizations in the past 4 or 5 years have begun to explain that the failure to prevent readmissions and other bad outcomes is due not to any failure in the services that were provided, but what they call the social determinants of health. Essentially a nice way of saying the poverty of their patients. Patients don't stay well because they're poor and they have no place to live, or they suffer from food insecurity, another euphemism for what we used to call hunger, or any other social support. So they keep cycling back to the emergency room. But there are solutions to these problems. And I would say to those who talk about social determinants of health, if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. I don't expect the medical profession to solve poverty, war, and injustice. That would be absurd. I've just insulted both of my children, by the way, both of whom are physicians and one of whom works in an emergency room. Well, it's one of my goals. I want you to laugh once and insult at least one person in the audience. They're so convenient as victims. They're used to it. Anyhow, I'm sorry. But I do think it's time for them to stop acting like aggressive capitalists and remember their mission as providers of public services, with all that that implies. So what on earth do we, particularly we women, do about this misogynist, anti-poor, anti-black, anti-immigration administration we are apparently stuck with for a couple of years? Sticking our heads either in the oven or under the covers isn't much of a solution, but what might be? Just saying no seems to have worked politically for the Republicans, not only in Washington but around the country, but it does not seem a viable approach for resistance to nihilism in 2018 and 2020. It's the vision thing that's wanted. The point here is that it's not too soon to begin to develop a bold new platform, and I'm going to have some suggestions that are a little bit on the way out there side. Not just a list to please every constituent group in America, but to define the basic elements of programs to deal with the problems besetting our country. And a program built on the values that make us proud to be Americans, not embarrassed or even ashamed. The feeble excuse that after the putative president issues each intemperate, uninformed tweet or bombastic threat, some of his more cautious lackeys temper or even rewrite what he said. That doesn't cut it. They should be ashamed of themselves. And so should the elected officials who, as recently as a year ago, called candidate Trump every bad name in the book, and then when he got elected became a batch of pusillanimous sycophants. He hasn't changed, but they have either changed their minds or lost them. He insults them, and they embrace him. Whatever happened to self-respect? And lo and behold, Congress is paralyzed, caught in a web of their own making. It would be funny if it weren't so pathetic. Impotence is not funny. And how ironic that power without purpose is the best we can hope for. As I use the word impotence, I cannot resist the temptation to point out that it was two Republican women who were the first two Republican resistors with the gonads to put a stop to that first Republican attempt to repeal Obamacare without a clue as to how to replace or reform it. I've never given money to a Republican in my life, but if Susan Collins should find herself in trouble, she'll get a check from me. And the same for Lisa Murkowski. If you want to take my point in a more appropriate body part, let me rephrase that to pointing out that Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, along with John McCain, showed that they had backbones as well as character and courage. Those characteristics, I might add, are gender neutral. So, since that auspicious day, the turmoil has simply gone over the top, and who knows where it will end, despite Tuesday's heartening news. So, for a unifying theme to express a more rational political alternative, a real deal instead of a raw deal, what would we like the program of the presidential candidate next to look like, and what would help to develop that program in the senatorial campaigns that are coming up? Starting to build a foundation for 2020. First and foremost, a return to civility. Second, a thoughtful program to deal with job and the associated benefit losses and the growing gap between rich and poor. Third, make some necessary choices to deal with the out-of-control cost of health care as well as higher education. I am insulting somebody else in this audience, probably. Fourth, deal firmly with the scourge of racism and the despoiling of the planet. Fifth, reduce the fear and costs of saber rattling. And God help me if I failed to include dealing with gender discrimination and the lack of support for women and children. On the economic issues, jobs, and the environment, we should look at the effects of automation and globalization, not immigration. The near collapse of unionization in the high-tech, high-salary sector as well as in the low-tech service sector. Skill requirements for existing jobs that our education system is not providing. None of these are easy problems with easy solutions, but what a travesty that the country that elected a very aristocratic Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression has turned its back on the very compassionate words that I saw just this past month on a visit to the memorial, his memorial in Washington. And if any of you have not seen it, I urge you to do so. It's absolutely mind-boggling. The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. Not the poor you shall always have with you, but the hands of brothers and sisters working with government, not against it. While the post-World War II era brought a boom in rebuilding a country that had spent its resources on defeating the Axis, hospitals and schools and colleges, prosperity for more and more Americans became not just a dream, but a reality. But by the beginning of the 1970s, things began to change. The war on poverty fell victim to the Vietnam War, while a more conservative ideology began to reassert itself, and taxation phobia became the new mantra. As to the cultural and social issues, racism, gender discrimination, and the loss of civility, I don't know of any magic formula for reversing the damage done by the current administration other than recommitting ourselves, black and white, men and women, citizens united, the good kind, and a determination to re-energize citizen-supported campaigns for equality, fairness, decency in public discourse, and a fair deal for all Americans. We are not looking for new ideas. There are plenty of good ideas already out there. What we lack is a consensus on which way to go and the political will to go, not with timidity or tinkering, but with focus, vigor, and perseverance. First, improve the purchasing power at the bottom for people at the bottom of the economic ladder. Minimum wage, obviously. Support serious union organizing, especially in the low-wage service economy. Third, expand those income gap measures called social wages, including, say, the earned income tax credit, Bernie's Medicare for all, and some variation of free or heavily subsidized higher education. And think seriously about expanding national service programs so that all of our children can serve their country. Fourth, and this is the most radical, I think, consider seriously a guaranteed minimum wage, or a negative income tax, as it has sometimes been called, as a replacement for the income support programs we now have. Its supporters include such notables as Pericles, Thomas Paine, Bertrand Russell, Milton Friedman, Martin Luther King, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Richard Nixon. The point here is it's time to rewrite the public dialogue, scrap the tired, timid halfway measures, as Don Berwick once put it, go big or go home. If we want to break through the pro-corporation, trickle-down economics, anti-government, anti-tax slough of despond we are currently stuck in, just like Christian and Paul Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. See, I told you I'd tell you. How many of you ever read Pilgrim's Progress? 2. Wow. All right. And we must present, I haven't. I just always liked the phrase. We must present a positive, strong, affirmative alternative. And how do they respond to the how do we pay for it question? First of all, you make the tax dodgers, super rich tax cheats, phony offshore corporate headquarters guys pay their fair share, and call out the kinds of highway robberies. This is the most outrageous recent one I heard. Some drug company has tried to sell the patent rights to its expensive new drug to an American Indian tribe. Why? Because the federal government can't sue a tribe. So, I mean, how cynical can they get? Don't let them get away with it. And I haven't even mentioned the cost of the Middle Eastern wars. Let's end them. Closing the tax loopholes that we've known about for decades. And my personal favorite would be get real about the inflated costs of medical care and higher education. Stop blaming the patients and passing the cost on to them. Regulate prices. Reestablish, well, maybe this is more radical than the other now that I think about it. Reestablish the prohibition on medical and drug advertising. Bring back health care planning. It will work, and it can fund a just and more compassionate America. And finally, I am getting to the end pretty soon. You are. You might ask at this point, where are the women's issues in this list? We obviously need to be at the table as voting members, as decision makers, as agenda setters, not just as outside advocates. Birth control, daycare, health care, survivor benefits, flexible hours, reproductive rights, maternity leave, benefits for low-wage contract workers, janitors, for example. I don't need to tell this audience what those issues are, but I do need to add that we have a commensurate obligation to step up and publicly speak out for the public funding to pay for them. We cannot wimp out on the how while we push for the what. The T word should not be whispered. Taxation is the price of civilization. Say it out loud and repeat it often. It only hurts the first time. How do we get public acceptance of this bold program? Who's going to do that job? We are. All of us, which leads me back finally to this one is getting to the end, to the issue of tactics. What works and what does not? Street protests and marches are a part of the program, but by themselves and without an accompanying strategy, they do not work. The Vietnam protests did not end the war. The Viet Cong did by winning. Occupy Wall Street was not a success. The civil rights protests surely did change this country, ending publicly supported segregation, if not the attitudes of some diehard racists, as we have sadly found out fairly recently. But the civil rights protests went hand in glove with carefully planned strategies and organized leadership. The 1963 March on Washington was orchestrated down to the most minute details and coordinated with the Kennedy administration. The point is that successful protests rely on a combination of a public expression of a cry for change combined with the old standbys of money, time, infrastructure, and access. In short, on politics and leadership. All of which leads me to the challenge I want to leave to you from that old labor song, go out and organize. Work for the election, and Ann said some of this, so I'll gallop through this. Work for the election of local city councilors and mayors. Never, ever, ever skip a primary. Drag your friends out to vote. Remind them that in 2014 midterm elections, lowest turnout in 70 years. And only 14% participated in Boston's primary and 27% last Tuesday. State legislative fights, referenda. Every election is a call for civic responsibility. Yes, go on marches as well, but exercise your civil obligations every day. Subscribe to your local newspaper. Write letters to the editor. Call your congressperson's office to say thank you or make sure that he's going to vote, or she, for an issue coming up. Attend local agency hearings or state house hearings. Contribute your time and your money. Volunteer for standouts. Judy, you like this? Where's Judy? Yeah, the standout queen. Knock on doors, circulate petitions. Is this new and different? No, it's what my football-loving friends call basic blocking and tackling. It works. And keep on doing it. Run for office yourself. Win or lose, testing yourself helps you to grow. Franklin Roosevelt in 1933 said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. A century before that, Emily Dickinson said, fortune befriends the bold. And Sheryl Sandberg, a century and a half later, rephrased it or plagiarized it as fortune favors the bold. We can, if we join together, stick together, and hang in there together over time, take back America the Beautiful. Let's get started.
Sit down and I'll call the panelists up.
Yes, ma'am.
And I've asked each of them to just pick some part of Dolores's talk that particularly strikes them and make a brief response. And I'm just going to very, very briefly introduce them. Their bios in the program. First, I would like to introduce Daphne Gluck, right near to me. She is an attorney from Israel, where she worked in the Office of Legal Counsel and Legislation in the Israeli Ministry of Justice. And we were very lucky to have her last year as a member of our graduate certificate program in gender leadership and public policy. I see Jackie Jenkins Scott in the back. Please come up and sit down. This is our fourth distinguished fellow. I introduced you in absentia. Daphne currently works with Lexidale International Policy Consulting, where she conducts comparative legal research. Our second panelist is Catherine Hornby, who currently serves as Assistant Secretary and Budget Director in the Executive Office of Administration and Finance. From 2010 to 2015, she was lucky enough to work for Dolores Mitchell as General Counsel and later Deputy Director of the Group Insurance Commission. And finally, I'm pleased to welcome Gail Jackson Blount, who serves as Board President for the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus, a very important friend and partner of this center. She has served on many boards for all kinds of good causes, from healthcare to opportunities for youth. And she currently is the founder and principal of Gail Jackson Communications, a consultancy providing communications, marketing services, business development, and major events management. So you can see, not only do we have a distinguished public service leader, we have a very distinguished panel, and I'm going to ask Daphne to start and just go down the line.
Is it on now? So yeah, this was a really, really inspiring speech and amazing and very hard to follow. I know Dolores as a mentor. I met her last year while participating in the Gender Leadership and Public Policy Graduate Certificate Program, and she was designated, luckily, to be my mentor. I asked for her, by the way. And I asked for her because in my first encounter with Dolores, I was most struck by her very direct, very nonsense approach. When she bluntly told our cohort that being interested in policy is not enough. You have to find actual things that you wanted to change within the policy world. And these words really struck a chord in me, because I was always the type of person who just said, oh, I like policy, I don't care. Whichever type, I will do anything. But the things that Dolores said meant that you have to find your passion, and you have to follow your passion, and it will lead you to the right places. It will help you make real change. And even though it's depressing in days like this to stay home and watch the TV, if you have a passion for something, it will drive you to go outside. And what strikes me as the major dilemma in considering Dolores' call to arms or call to action is how is it best these days, particularly to make a real difference? My career, most of my career has been in government, working in public service. It was my favorite place to work in. I still feel that the most difference that you can make, the most power you can have to change things, the tools that you have and the perspective that you get when you work in government is the best that you can get. And at the same time, I also think that a strong public service which provides sound professional advice and preserves continuity in a democracy is really essential in sustaining stable and good democracies. But then at the same time, when you work for administrations, you know that things change and you don't always serve the policies or the exact ideas that you believe in. And as a good public servant, you know how to negotiate these changes, you know how to work with different policies and achieve the best results that can be or that you can think. And those of us who've worked for government know that this is completely possible. You can do the best you can, even if you don't completely agree or believe in the policies that you have to serve. But then what happens in times like this, when there is such a major shift and things get very radical? And I've been thinking this, I feel like coming from Israel, I can give some perspective to what goes on here, because it's a process that's been going on for a very, very long time there, and it's a dilemma that I have faced for a very long time while I was working. But at what point do you say, I'm not doing more good than harm? At what point do you say, I cannot affect change or positive change where I am? And also, when you're inside, and this has been discussed a lot, your perspective changes, and there's always a fear of a slippery slope where you suddenly lose your red lines, they keep shifting, and you find yourself doing things that maybe if you would have looked at it from outside, you wouldn't have done them. So the question is, is this the time where you should say, okay, you can only affect real change from outside, you can only do good things from outside? And this point is also troubling to me, and I think, and it has been discussed, I'm not the first one to raise this, but that one of the most disturbing legacies of the Trump administration may be the adverse effect on the American public service, and the fact that many career public servants are leaving the federal government offices, and I think that's extremely negative in the long run. So this is my question. Which way? What's the good direction? Where can you affect the most change?
Hi, my name is Catherine Hornby. I was not, as Dolores may have suspected, checking my messages during this presentation, but was instead taking down a few notes of things that particularly caught my attention in what Dolores said earlier, and both things that stood out for me and things where I might have a sort of a slightly different spin, and so I wanted to mention a few of them. First, with... sure, yes. First... I I see the difference now. First, I think that it is worth noting that many of us are supported by good men, and that Dolores had mention of Governor Dukakis. I think many of us have good men in our lives, and I think that it just sort of bears noting that in thinking about women's empowerment and in thinking about strong women and how strong women are successful, I think we should welcome the support and the leadership of strong men. My husband makes breakfast for me, and that is something for which I am grateful. And so I just wanted to kind of say that there are many alliances to be had. And I think Dolores has taken advantage of so many of those alliances, and in this time of divisiveness, it's worth kind of remembering that there are many possible alliances. Another thing that stood out for me in listening to Dolores, which is, I would say, not the first time I've had this reaction, is that it's one thing to say Dolores is not afraid of a fight, which plainly she isn't. What's more interesting is that she actually enjoys it. And I think more of us and more in elected office could enjoy it more. I think if we could have more fun and fear less, then I think that the public debate would be more enjoyable and less sort of hard. I think if people were less afraid of losing a good fight, then maybe we could get more done, that we could acknowledge that it is entirely possible to give your all to a perspective where your side loses, and that's okay. And then you give your all the next time, and you keep genuinely enjoying it. I think that there's so much of value that can be gained there, and I think too many people are just afraid. And you think, well, afraid of what? Afraid that you'll lose? Who cares? Next, I think along those lines, so many of the things that Dolores has fought for are around systemic change. And I think there are many approaches on this, and this got me thinking a little bit. Dolores and I are very different people. I think Dolores is very different from most people. I think she is a firecracker in ways that most of us are not. I am a much more private person. I'm never going to run for office. I don't really like campaigns, but I think that this fundamental call to engage, it can be done in different ways. I think engagement can be through holding placards. It can be through running for elected office. It can be through through financial contributions to candidates we like. It can be through taking jobs and taking roles that are positive and are constructive in society. And I think Daphne's comments there, as someone we haven't previously met, but from your description of working, or your reference, I would say, to working as a lawyer in an administration, is a way of engaging which may not be public, but it is still engagement, and I think it's the engagement that matters. I think on a related note, engagement matters and substance matters. I think there's an awful lot of talk these days, and it would be great if there were, on a lot of fronts, more substance. Dolores is a champion of substance. With healthcare, we don't talk about, healthcare access is great, but healthcare pricing and the details of healthcare pricing, how do manufacturer rebates work, and are manufacturer rebates basically a good thing because we get money back, or are they basically a bad thing because they obscure the true cost of drugs and allow different drugs across different markets? So, think what you will, but I like engagement on matters of substance, of true substance. I'm going to have one more comment that I want to make, and then I will hand it over, which is, we engage differently, and some of us are more private and some of us are more public, but I think it is critical that we talk outside of our own circles, whether that is reading outside of our own circles. I'm always sort of interested after major events. I see, how does the Globe cover it, but then I also I look up newspapers in cities that strike me as conservative and see, how do they cover it, or do they cover it at all? So talk outside of our own circles, listen outside of our own circles, and hopefully that we can reform into a society as opposed to these cocoons of information. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Gail Jackson Blount, And as the president of the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus, it is such a pleasure to meet you, Dolores. This is my first time having an opportunity to meet her. And I have served on the board of directors for almost 8 years now. And 4 of those years have been in a leadership position as the vice president of the organization. And since January, I was appointed as its first president of color. And that's in the 48-year history of the organization. And so I would like to say, one, that's something that shows great progress. I would like to also say that this is an extraordinarily wonderful time for us in Boston history and Massachusetts history. We had endorsed 39 women to run for public office, and 29 of those women, we endorsed 38 women, 29 of those women won, with the highest percentage of women of color ever. And I think that is a great testament and a tribute to all of you. In fact, I was going to say, let's give yourselves a round of applause. So thank you for that. And it goes to show that times are changing. I think that Boston has traditionally been, even though they say that we've been a liberal state, we've also been very conservative. And so I think that it really shows that we are paying attention. I think that people are starting to realize that they need to become more engaged. Every single thing that you've talked about in terms of getting involved, no matter how small it is, but making a difference, because unless you get involved, you can't complain about the issues that you face every day. And so I would like to say that one of the issues and many of the issues that we address all the time with women in particular is that women usually have to be asked many times to run for office, to even consider running for office. As you know, we have so many other challenges to deal with. A man, and I'm glad to see several of you here this evening. A man can decide, in one conversation, that I'm going to run for office. Sit there and go out with a drink with a buddy and say, I'm going to run for office. And the next thing you know, he's on the phone calling up his buddies, and he's got a check for $5,000, another, $2,500 over here. And with women, we have to really consider, is this something that I can do? Can I afford to step away from my job? Who's going to take care of the children? Who's going to cook dinner for that wonderful husband that I have? There's so many other issues, and we're also the primary caregivers in our households. So those are challenges that we face, and we also have to take into consideration. And so when a woman makes that decision and steps out there and says, I am going to go for it, that's a huge choice that they're making and a huge commitment. And in order for them to continue to be successful, we have to continue doing everything within our power to support them, because it's the women having that opportunity to be a part of influencing policy and decisions that impact our lives and the lives of our children, the lives of our families, the lives of our parents, and the lives of our country. This country as a whole. I think that we need to do whatever we can to support them. And for those of you who are here, I'd like to thank you for your work. And I would also like to acknowledge one of our board members who's here, Joyce Faribault Bowling, who's also on your board, Ian. And I'd like to thank you, first of all, for hosting this forum and for the work that you're doing with this fellows program, because I think it's just phenomenal, because we're learning. I've learned so much, just listening to you this evening, Dolores. But I would like, the reason I singled out our board member, Joyce, is because she has single-handedly worked with every single one of the female candidates of color who's won this election, this term. And, by mentoring them, guiding them, helping them raise money. And that's one of the things that we do with the Mass Women's Political Caucus, is that we, in addition to endorsing women, who want to run for office, we also help them. We provide them with the professional resources and professional development. We help them with their public speaking skills. We help them build a campaign and understand what it takes to build a campaign that's a winning team. What's required. You need a finance person. You need a strategist. You know, you need fundraising. So there's all kinds of things that we help women do. And in addition to when it's time for them to get out into the field, we have a very robust internship program where we bring in interns from colleges and universities from across the Commonwealth. And our interns are out there. They're those boots on the ground. You know, they're there, you know, sign holding, making phone calls, helping to door knock. And it's those skills and that support that makes all the difference in the world. And I guess if I have to ask a question, it would be several of the things that you mentioned that are necessary in order to make a difference in our society. Many of those hard fought and earned gains are at a loss right now. They're all vulnerable with this new administration. And so, what do we do? What are some of the things that we do that's going to, there are people right now, they are so disillusioned, and they are so disengaged and uninspired. And so what are we to do as a society that will make a difference, in these, over these next, 2 years? Unfortunately, if we have to go through this for another 2 years, but if we do, how should we be preparing ourselves, to challenge the status quo? Because by that time, so much will have been dismantled, and that's what we have to be concerned about. So, thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, well, I want to thank all our panelists, and I want to invite Dolores to come back up and give her the opportunity to respond to some of the great questions of the panelists, and then we're going to open it up for your questions and comments.
Well, let's see. I think Daphne pointed to a very important issue, namely, I think the issue of where do you draw the line? Compromise by itself is not a sin. Trade-offs are the bread and butter of politics. You can't get anywhere if you're not willing to swap support for somebody else's bill if they'll support yours. The trick is how far can you go? Compromise and trade-offs are fine, but selling your soul is not. And where do you draw that line, and how do you know? I think it's really got to be, here in your heart and soul. I have worked for more Republican governors than, in fact, Democratic governors. But I worked for them at the Group Insurance Commission in insurance, where my goals and their goals were essentially compatible. Not identical, and sometimes they pushed me on things I didn't want, but there were no great philosophical differences. I don't think in some of those administrations I could have been the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And that's, I think, the point at which I would have to say, I think that I should not be here. I have told every secretary that I worked for that although unfortunately for them, they couldn't fire me because I didn't work for them. Since my commission was semi-autonomous. But I have said to them, I can get along, I have gotten along with both Republicans and Democrats. But if the time comes when our paths go too divergent, just tell me and I will leave, and leave without any rancor. And I said without any noise. I don't know if I could have done that, but anyhow, I offered. But I think we just have to know that in our own soul. I look at some of these folks in the current administration, some of whom I think are decent folks, and I don't know why they're still there. I think some of them must be awfully close to the edge from time to time. And I think, in England, if you screw up, you're supposed to resign your cabinet position. If you find there's a strong philosophical difference, an honorable person, an honorable member of the cabinet, is supposed to and does resign. We don't have that tradition in this country quite so much. But We had it during the Nixon debacle when Archibald Cox and Elliot Richardson said, no, I'm not going to do this. That's where they drew the line. So I think there's no pat answer to it. Each person has to find that inside his or her own soul. Catherine is, of course, right that I enjoy a good fight. Actually, the days that I was the happiest when in the Group Insurance Commission were the days when all hell was breaking loose. And, you know, we were getting screamed at from 6 different directions, and I would come home saying, wow, that was a great day. You need to have, you need to have a kind of a strong ability to deal with stress. And I guess God gave me a strong ability to deal with stress. Of course, I drink, but not at work, ever, ever, ever. So I don't know. That's not much of an answer. Let's see. I mean, I totally agree with Catherine that, talking outside of your own circle is really important. I used to refer at the office to the Boston Herald as the people's newspaper, and I would chide my staff occasionally because they only read the Globe. And one other one. Barney Frank once told me something that I never forgot, which is, it came into the Governor Dukakis' office one day with an article about something that was going on in the economy in holding the business section. Well, I used to skip the business section. It didn't apply to me. You better read the Wall Street Journal. You better read the Herald. It's hard. I mean, I don't know very many Republicans, frankly. I'd be happy to talk to them if I knew one, but and it's difficult in Massachusetts, but it's not impossible. And I think making an effort to do that is really very important. When I was in Ohio, when, oh God, this is going to date me. Well, never mind. No, when I was in Ohio, had come from graduate school, and I had to go home because my mother was ill. This was in 1952. And Adlai Stevenson, my PhD friends, wrote to me and told me that Stevenson was going to carry the East Coast and the West Coast and Illinois and a couple of other states, and he was going to pull it out and win. And I was in Ohio helping to take care of my mother, and I remember writing back, we wrote in those days, wrote back and said, are you out of your mind? You should be here, and I can tell you that ain't gonna happen. And of course it didn't. It was a total wipeout. So you gotta be careful. We do live in a bit of an information cocoon of our own here. Go visit your relatives in Alabama, or if you have any, and you'll find out that it's not so easy. Gail, I just have one bone to pick with you. Your husband can damn well cook dinner for you. Never mind about you being responsible to cook one for him.
That is true. But I wasn't referring to myself. I was referring to women just in general. That's always an excuse that they use.
Yeah. But you asked what was the most important thing we could do, and I want to answer that question. I think the single most important thing to do, other than to subscribe to and work on every one of those things that I suggested, is work on turnout. Work on turnout for those people who are most negatively affected by what the outcome turns out to be. And let's be very frank, you know who I'm talking about. If people who are poor, if people who are minorities, if women, ladies, women, turn out in sufficient numbers, we can change this country. But if they stay home, not going to happen. So I think that's the single most important thing we could do, other than, as I say, support all of my ideas.
So I'd like to take at least 5 or 10 minutes for some questions, because I think we have a spectacular speaker and panelists, and I'd like to give people in the audience a chance. Yes, up there. Go ahead. Yes.
I have 2 questions that are related in the healthcare field. And you talked about pharma, which is a very reliable generator of profits, and it is in every foundation, every trust, university's foundational investments.
Yep.
They are in the top 10 that are held. I think the only way you get control over that, because no university, no foundation is going to say, I want pharma to lower its profits. They should be turned into a public utility. You can still make a profit, and this country supplies 90% of the world's research for drugs that go out into the world. So everyone sitting in this room paying taxes, all of the disease foundations that raise money, this and the tax money is going to what supports that work. But they need to be a public utility, so how it's spent is controlled. It's spent on profits. And the second question I would like to ask is, in the healthcare field for the elderly, residing in the community, we depend upon many low-income women and some men to go into the homes to do this care. Now, the only way their salary or income is going to improve, it's going to be leveled off at some point. Often you'd say, well, more education for them. They're already required to do some. But their background, especially their inabilities in language, English is not often their first language. So they would have a terribly hard time going on into collegiate programs. But I think for every year that they work, and most of them are being paid indirectly by the state with our tax money, should be given credits that they can use to apply, not credits for marks, but credits for finance to go to the state system. And they, I am sure, would love that. It would bring their children up. Thank you.
I'm gonna take that as a comment rather than a question, unless one of you wants to respond. I mean, it's nice to find somebody who's more radical than I am. That's very good. So, do any of you want to comment on that? I'm giving Catherine the evil eye and suggesting she might,
So
as
I'm
a
gonna
budget person, which she is.
So I think I'm going to skip the public utilities piece and focus more on the home care workers. I think that the situation, for the most part, as you correctly pointed out, home care workers are paid by the state with some federal contributions, and essentially you have one buyer that goes through a number of vendors and then is paying a large number of people who are relatively replaceable in terms of skill set. And I think that the problem, figuring a way out of that is, while keeping the budget in balance, is it's not apparent to me how that works, because the scale is tremendous. So I'm not saying I have the answer. I'm just saying, I mean, maybe the answer, I hear taxes in the front row.
I know, but Dolores said, let's not be afraid of that word, taxes.
Yeah, but I think the problem that from where I sit, the problem that we grapple with is scale. That it's one thing to say everybody deserves to be paid better, and they probably do. They almost certainly do. You multiply it out and you figure out, how does this all work? And you have to have an answer to that question. Taxes is an answer.
But in addition to that, if we in fact had a negative income tax, it's kind of self-correcting. That is to say, nobody's going to pay somebody $50,000 a year, but they might have a base of $15,000 from which earnings would supplement. So there are some options that may be out there. And of course, all of that money goes back into the economy. Somebody who is earning $30,000 or $40,000 a year is going to spend every penny of it. I mean, that's what's wrong with the tax bills that have been proposed. Is that for the very wealthy, it'll go into another yacht or another house or another whatever, or into a offshore account in Bermuda or someplace, but not into the rest of the economy. So we need another question. Did we really stupefy all of you? Aha. Yeah.
You talked about the two-tier economy.
The what
Two-tier economy.
Yeah.
And the divisions in income that people have. One of the
Do I know about what needs to be done?
Do you know about the fact that the inequality has expanded again? And what, other than going to court, which I think may be the only way to do it again, what other ideas do you think?
That's a big one. You're looking as though you want it pensive. Does that mean you want to say something and save me? That's, you see why one of the things I didn't say is always hire somebody who's smarter than you are.
I would dispute that. I'm not sure I understand the question. Are we talking about education, like school, K through 12 education? Yeah.
K through 12, she says.
Yes. So, I'll hand it back to Dolores.
I don't know. School finance reminds me of EOBs you get from your hospital. I mean, they're so complicated. It's so complicated. I don't understand half of the time what those school refunding formulae do. Peggy, are you shaking your head because you know the answer to this question?
Unfortunately, no.
Oh, you're agreeing with Alice.
The answer, of course, is that we have to raise additional funds to deal with it.
Yeah.
If we don't, then we will continue to spawn the poverty that we have now instead of dealing with the issues that we have.
Although I think there are a lot of other questions besides that. I mean, I think, for example, my town is considering raising or increasing the school day by 15 minutes. You would think that the world was coming to an end. I mean, I look at what my granddaughter, who lives in England and went through English public schools, not fancy public schools, but regular schools, what her school day was like, and I mean, it's staggering, the difference. I live right near the high school, and those kids, all of whom have their own cars and park in front of my house, but they're out of there by 2:30. There isn't a soul there. I mean, there's a whole range of stuff we need to do other than just equalizing the return on to the school system from the Commonwealth to or the country to the various school districts. Although I will say one of my chief complaints about my own town is that they won't build a new school. And while I was at the GIC, we had a lot of health fairs and a lot of public high schools in this state, and a lot of the community colleges. And there's a lot of really first-class equipment and school buildings out there, not just in Wellesley and Dover. Also in Lawrence and Quincy. Maybe Quincy doesn't. I know Lawrence does because it's got a fabulous high school. Judy knows what some of the others are. So I keep saying, why are everybody what's wrong here? What I see is beautiful school buildings that look as though they're equipped up the wazoo. I don't know. I clearly am deficient in my knowledge about the public school financial institution. So mea culpa. And we got two more. We just got them going here.
Thank you for your comments and also for the panel. You mentioned, and thank you especially for raising people who are economically poor. As you said in the last campaign, we spent like about this much speaking about people who are on the margins. And I think it connects with what you were saying too about the turnout. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, what are some practical ways in which, short of changing the way in which we vote, like doing it from 7 to 7 when some people can't get to the polls, or on Sunday, is a whole other story. So I think that's the basic thing we have to look
Good
at.
point.
But until we can change that, what are some practical ways in which you can support people who are working 2-3 jobs? What are some other ways in which, besides driving people to the polls, but some other ways that we need to look at? How do I say support you? And maybe babysit for an hour or something. I don't know. Just some other ways. But some very practical ways in which you can help the turnout. Maybe that's one of the ways we need to look at. How do we go into communities and find what are the needs in helping people to go vote, as well as educating them to to what the issues are and listening to them.
Well, one thing is an awful lot of people don't know about mail-in voting or early voting, and I'm surprised at how few people do, in fact, know the mechanics of how you go about doing that. So some kind of public education program in which you say you don't have to be available on Tuesday from 7 in the morning to 7 at night. You can go to your town hall and get an absentee ballot, or you can, where you have early voting, you can take advantage of it. You can write letters to the editor reminding people. If you have, as we do, a weekly newspaper that I'm afraid has gotten to be pretty weak, they don't do an awful lot of stuff whipping up enthusiasm for voting far enough in advance so people could take advantage of it. So those local cable television programs are a good resource that people don't necessarily take a sufficient advantage of. Going to the having a bake sale at the primary. That's why I was really disappointed when I went Tuesday. They didn't have it for the final. I was counting on it for dessert, but clearly we need to change. It would be wonderful to change the day. Why? I mean, I understand how the history is of why it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday, but what a dumb day to have. We could have it a national holiday. They took away Veterans Day. They could give us something back of more meaning. No, God, don't. I didn't say that. What?
Make Veterans Day into the National Election Day.
It's in November. Yeah, you could. That's a good idea. Honor veterans by voting. It's voting day. Yeah, that's great. I like it.
Okay, we had one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you said that, I think your first recommendation was to return to civility, and you talked about the need not to be fearful. And we are facing elections, I think, in the next year where I foresee a horrendous environment. Can you play out a scenario where we start a return to civility? What kind of leadership do you think is key? And who should we look to? What institutions?
Well, as a person who hasn't stepped inside of a house of worship in 30 years, I would say we've got churches. I think one could try, because they're an appropriate kind of vehicle to be the ones who will step up and say, I find that kind of language unacceptable. Candidates themselves, you're supposed to be a good sport. Excuse me. One of the mistakes that I thought Hillary Clinton made in the debates is when candidate Trump walked around the stage distracting attention from her and then had the gall to stand behind her, and the moderator didn't have the common sense or brains to say, Mr. Trump, go sit down, Mrs. Clinton is speaking. Call them on it. Don't be passive and assume that that's being a good sport. I remember when Mike Dukakis won the election in in the last century, whenever it was, Mary Fifield, who was the press secretary, said to me, go out and announce that we have won. And I said, Mary, I am very experienced at being a good loser. I don't know how to handle being a winner and still being gracious. I think it's just despicable that you can't have that. Never mind being a good loser, but how about being a good winner? But somebody has to call them on it every time, and nobody calls them on it. And as I say, I speak to the clergy. I speak to the League of Women Voters, for heaven's sakes. They're nonpartisan. They ought to be speaking up and criticizing people who cross that line of civility and decency. Editorial writers write a letter to the editor, or go see the editor and say, what are you doing about this? See if you, if you read the paper and you read the letters to the editor, there are chronic letter writers and they're the same people all the time. Make that as your personal thing. Every time somebody goes over the line, write a letter and say, how about so-and-so shouldn't have been allowed to say that and get away with it. I don't know. That's about all. It's public opinion, I guess.
Thank you. Okay, well, we've come to a close, but I just want to give a few thank yous. First of all, there's no event like this that gets organized by one person. It takes a village, takes a team. So I want to thank Denise Schultz. I'm not sure, is she still there? Our Director of Operations and Outreach, Ann Foreman, our Alumni Coordinator for the program. Thank you both very much for all your hard work. We've also had great assistance from Jessie Azong. Is she still here? Okay. And our doctoral student, Priyanka Kabir. Two of our work study students, Jess Sanchez and Elizabeth Riddle. I want to thank all of those people for their help. I also see a couple of members of my board that I didn't see at the beginning, like our president, Digna Saad Scott, who is here. Thank you very much for coming. And Joyce Faribault Bowling, emeritus member Marie Turley. If I'm leaving anybody out, please forgive me. Alice, I talked about you before you walked in. So thank you all for coming. I just mainly want to thank so much Dolores. I think that was just an amazing talk. I want to sit down and read it and think about it, and I want to thank the panelists so much. I think we got great perspectives, great questions, and great questions from the audience. So please stay for the reception. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you'll join us for the 4th in this series, which will bring in the spring. Thank you so much.